Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the opposing arguments to the idea of God, that God exists and that God is the creator. We're not going to do this a lot in Genesis. Mainly we're going to do it in chapters 1 and 2. We're going to talk a little bit about atheism. We're going to talk a little bit about evolution. And then we're going to leave it and only talk about the biblical text and spiritual stuff and how it applies to our lives, what the text is saying and what it means as far as our understanding goes and as far as our walk with God goes. But we've got to pay attention to these distractions because they're crowding in on us in our world. And the people that you and I teach, and even the things that we read and the people we hear, we need to know that they're answers to these arguments. We don't just say, well, I believe, I don't want to listen to that. No, they're answers. And they're good answers. I tell you that Professor Dawkins pleads with us not to believe in God because he can't imagine a God. So he therefore concludes that God is impossible because he can't imagine him. Christopher Hitchin begs us not to believe in God from a position of moral outrage. In other words, he believes that if God exists, that God must be very, very bad. We'll talk about that point of view in a moment, or maybe tomorrow. What I want to talk about right now is the whole idea of atheism and the atheistic arguments and what Scripture is telling us. I realize that with you, I'm preaching to the choir. I realize that you would not be here unless you did believe in God. But let me tell you something. I'm a little bit older than you are. And I sat next to people in classes like this when I was a young man who had the same motives that you have. And they were gifted, and they were motivated, and they wanted to be teachers. One of them went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School after he left the University of Georgia, where two of you have gone. One of them went to Moody Bible Institute, where two of my children graduated. And today, these people are atheists or agnostics. So, 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to sanctify Christ in our hearts and to always be ready to give an account for the faith that is within us, to be ready to meet these challenges. And so for this reason, only in the first couple of lectures are we going to take a little bit of time to talk about atheism and to talk about evolution. When we leave it after Genesis 2 or Genesis 3, we will have left it for good. We have to talk about evolution a little bit in Genesis 7 through 9 when we talk about the flood, and a little bit in chapter 11 when we talk about the Tower of Babel. Let me say first of all that no atheist wants to talk about why anything is here, because no atheist can explain that. And the irony is that atheists pretend to be such intellectuals. And they talk down as if they're talking from a superior intellectual position to these poor, ignorant people who believe in God. Now that's very ironic because their position cannot account for anything. Their position cannot account for anything. They don't know why anything is here. They don't know how anything got here. And they begin with assumptions. And here's the assumption they make. They say, well, let's begin with energy and matter. And when you hear an atheist say that, you say, hold it right there. No. You don't begin with energy and matter. You account for energy and matter. You tell us how energy and matter got here. 2 weeks ago, I was teaching in Chemnitz, Germany, the former East Germany. In a church from Leipzig was having a retreat there, and I was teaching there. I was teaching from the Gospel of John. And there was an atheist in the audience. He was married to an Irish Christian. He's an Englishman. And I talked about cosmology a little bit in John 1. Cosmology is the study of the beginnings of the universe. And he was very nice to me. He was very cordial to me. And he said, I was very, very interested in what you have to say because I'm an atheist and I'm a cosmologist. That's what he said. I said, how can you be an atheist when the universe exists? How can you account for the universe? And he says, well, I know that certain chemical reactions in the laboratory can actually happen, even though it's very, very unlikely that they would happen. I said, yes, but where do you get the chemicals from to react? He wouldn't talk about it. He couldn't talk about it. He has no answer for that. Well, actually, the atheist does offer an answer, and I'll say something about that in a moment. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, the Marxist who died in 1980, the great French writer, Sartre said that the greatest philosophical problem, when did I say he died? 1980, yeah. He was born in 1905, he died in 1980. Sartre said that the greatest philosophical problem is why there is something rather than nothing. And you know what? If you're an atheist, you bet that's a problem. That's a huge problem. That's an embarrassing problem. That's an overwhelming problem. As a matter of fact, it's a problem which should stop you from being an atheist. At least Sartre had the candor and the honesty to admit that it was a problem. Dawkins won't admit it's a problem. What Dawkins says is this. Dawkins doesn't talk about why anything is here. Dawkins admits that the atheist and the biologist cannot account for and the evolutionist cannot account for the existence of life. And what Dawkins says is this: cosmology awaits its Darwin, even as biology has already had its Darwin. Now, you see what a religious statement that is? He has faith that a prophet will rise up and explain what he can't explain. You see, it's religion. He says, oh, we can't explain it, but someone will come along and explain it within our system, not your system, but our system. Okay, I said that the atheist actually does have an answer. It's really not an answer. It's a debating point where they try to neutralize our position. Here's what they say. When we say, in your system, you cannot account for the fact that God is here, the fact that anything is here. Why do you believe what you believe? Instead of answering that question, here's what they say. They say, well, you can't account for why God is here. You can't explain how God got here. So we have the same problem. The two problems are equal. Therefore, it's a tie. I just prefer the non-theistic explanation, and you prefer the theistic explanation, but your problem is not any easier than our problem. That's what they say, and that satisfies them. That's not true, though. The problems are not equal. And let me tell you why the problems are not equal. First of all, it gets back to the problem that Dawkins cannot conceptualize the idea of God. The whole point about God is that He has no beginning. The whole point about God is that He's not created. The whole point about God is He didn't come from anywhere. He just is. And everything exists because of Him. God is the uncreated creator, which is a concept that Dawkins cannot fit into his brain. Therefore, he believes that the concept does not exist. But there's a bigger problem. Aristotle, who was a pretty good philosopher, he was certainly not a Christian, and he didn't believe in a God who was like the Christian God. Aristotle said that it is much more likely that mind would produce non-mind than that non-mind would produce mind. Are you with me? Here's what Aristotle said. He said it's much more likely that something or someone with a mind could make something without a mind. That's much more likely than that something without a mind could make someone with a mind. But the evolutionist and the atheist says that mind accidentally evolved over millions of years from things without a mind. Now, I think I gave this example in John 1, but I'm going to share it again. My wife lectures on art at the Fine Arts Museum in Budapest. I don't know anything about art. I mean, after I've said, yep, that's a picture, all right, I've said about all I know. I can't keep talking about a work of art. She can. She gives lectures on it. Now, I think I only know the name of 3 sculptors in the world. 3 pieces of sculpture. The Thinker, the Kiss, and David. Next Monday, I'm going to Florence, God willing. The David is in Florence. I don't know if I'll see it or not. The last time I was in Florence, I didn't try to see it because the lines were too long, and the lines will be long next week. The David was sculpted by Michelangelo. Here's what the atheist is telling us. The atheist is telling us that it is just as likely that the components which exist within the David could accidentally produce Michelangelo. That's just as likely as the components like the components in Michelangelo could produce the David. Here's what the evolutionist and the atheist says. That things without life, things without mind, things like the stone and the metal and the paint in the statue, the David, that those things could somehow accidentally bump around over time and produce someone like Michelangelo, that's just as likely as the idea that some things which were combined like the things in Michelangelo could produce the David. It's the exact same argument. Now, I've shared that with unbelievers, and they say, no, it's not the same argument because there are only 3 or 4 things in the David. There's metal and there's stone and there's coloring, whereas there are billions of things in the universe. I say, okay, so there's billions of things in the universe, but they're all like the things in the David. They have no life. They have no mind. Maybe you've got other things like the stone and the metal, and maybe you heat it to 1,000,000 degrees, or maybe you freeze it to absolute 0. Maybe it exists in a different temperature. Maybe it's traveling in a different speed. Maybe it exists in a different combination. But it's still just like the things in the statue. It has no life. So for the atheist to say that I've got the same problem that he's got because I can't account for God, and that the dead things in the universe were just as likely to create life and poetry and music and meaning and mind and man as a living creator God is likely to create those things, that's madness. That's absolute madness. That is a philosophy for fools. So, don't ever let an atheist say to you Well, let's assume matter and energy. You say, no, 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 you cannot assume that. You've got to tell me how it got here. And don't ever let an atheist tell you that our philosophical problem in accounting for the existence of God is just as great as their philosophical problem in accounting for the existence of everything. They are not equivalent problems. They are very, very different problems. One is a tiny problem, and one is an enormous, overwhelming problem. Those problems are not the same size. Now, I also mentioned this in John 1:1 when we were talking about the Logos. So some of you who watched the video, and maybe some of you in the class, have heard this argument from John 1:1. The atheist cannot account for things, and the atheist cannot account for life, and the atheist cannot account for mind. But even if the atheist could account for all that, the atheist could not account for meaning. The question is, if the universe is accidental and random, then it doesn't mean anything. Now here's the question, where does meaning come from? And if the universe is accidental, then everything is accidental. Why did the accident happen? I had an appointment here this morning. So I left Budapest yesterday. And I flew in an airplane. And then I got on a train. And I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. You came from the places you were because you had an appointment here today, just after 10 o'clock. That wasn't an accident. It was planned. There are billions of plans which are being realized on Monday mornings all over the world. Why did the accident stop? Why did things stop being accidental and start being planned? The Christian says it's because things were planned from the beginning. It's because the universe itself is not an accident. The universe is a function of design. Now, here's what we did in John 1, which has to do with meaning. That was the argument about accident. Here's the argument which has to do with meaning. If there's no God, which the atheist contends, if there's no God, then there's no Creator. And Genesis 1:1 is about our Creator God. But if there's no God, there's no Creator. If there's no Creator, there's no designer. If there's no designer, there's no design. If there's no design, there's no purpose. And if there's no purpose, there's no meaning. Because meaning is a function of purpose. So if there's no God, there's no Creator. If there's no Creator, there's no designer. If there's no designer, there's no design. If there's no design, there's no purpose. If there's no purpose, there's no meaning. But there is meaning, isn't there? If there weren't any meaning, we would have never been able to say about anything that it has no meaning. Even the concept of meaningless is only possible if there's meaning. You understand?
TBS Seminary is a nonprofit project. Our joint effort will bring about the common purpose of making Christian education available around the world and developing good Christian servant leaders. You have a unique opportunity to partner in this effort through your prayer and/or financial support of TVS Ministry. For more information, please visit tvsseminary.com.
There is meaning. So if there's meaning, there must be purpose. If there's purpose, there must be design. If there's design, there's a designer. If there's a designer, there's a creator. And if there's a creator, there's a God. Now, there's not only meaning. Now, this is hard, and you're probably not going to get this in English, but maybe you will, because maybe the Russian word is like the English word. But the problem is that even when you know English, this is hard to understand, okay? There's not only meaning, but there's transcendent meaning. I should have written it all. Let me do it like this. I didn't want to write on the wet board. Transcendence. Do you have this word in Russian? Is it the same word? Yes? Good. It's still hard to understand even when you know the word. Transcendence is something above ourselves, something that's higher than us, and also something that's deeper than us. And there's some realities, there's some truths, there's some meaning which we know to be transcendent. Let me give you some examples. Music is transcendent. Music takes us out of ourselves. You probably know that Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, the founder of the Soviet state, he stopped listening to music. Did you know that? You know why? It wasn't because he didn't like it, it was because he did like it. It's because he cared too much about it. And it brought him out of himself. And it distracted him from his purpose. He was a man of one purpose. He was a single-minded man, and he was single-minded about revolution, about the destruction of capitalism, the establishment of communism. And he was afraid of music, what music did to him. So he stopped listening to it. Patriotism is transcendent. Patriotism gives us a lump in our throat. What do you feel when you see your athlete climb to the highest stand at the Olympics and your flag is raised and your song is played? It gives you a little lump in your throat. The way you feel about your country, even the way you feel about sport. The Olympics itself, it's transcendent. You know what's really transcendent is love. A young man came to see me many years ago who was an atheist, and he came to see me because he'd fallen in love with a girl in our church. He was a graduate of Harvard University, and the great influence on his life was Richard Dawkins. This was before Dawkins became a famous atheist. This was before he wrote The God Delusion, and he'd written a book called The Blind Watchmaker, which is also an attack on the possibility of God. And this young man was full of Dawkins. He was a medical student. And he was a good debater. He was a very good debater. And the only point that I was able to get him to admit that he was wrong about, or that he didn't have an explanation for it, is that he knew that the love that he had for this girl was transcendent. He knew that it couldn't be explained by biology. And that was the first crack in his atheism. I didn't lead him to Christ, but later he was led to Christ by a pastor in San Diego, California, and he's a Christian today. But the first thing that made him understand that was this business of transcendence. There's not only meaning, There's meaning above us. There's meaning that takes us out of ourselves. There's meaning which has always been there. Meaning is not something that's developed from the bottom up. Meaning is something that is discovered. It's something that is derived. It's something that's always existed in the mind of God.